Trump's trade war strategy, secret plan behind Trump's tariffs? Can you really sleep these days with all the shocking tariff news and market chaos? It almost makes you miss Sleepy Joe because at least when he was president, things were quieter and you could actually sleep. Donald Trump has shaken the whole world and the entire financial market keeps swinging every time he changes his mind on tariffs. It feels like if you don't check your phone for 5 minutes, everything has already changed. On April 5th, Liberation Day, as Trump called it, he announced a long list of countries that would face new reciprocal tariffs. For example, China got hit with a 34% tariff on top of the previous 20%, Vietnam 46%, Cambodia 49%, and so on. Even remote places like the Penguin Islands, where only penguins live, now face a 10% base tariff. Shortly after that, Trump said the tariffs would not be changed, causing the market to drop sharply. The S&P 500 fell more than 20% from its all-time high, reaching a crash-level decline. China retaliated with a 34% tariff on U.S. imports. In response, Trump struck back by raising tariffs on Chinese goods to 104%. Then, on April 9th, Trump paused lower tariffs for more than 70 countries, setting a new base rate of 10% for 90 days, except for China, which saw its tariff rise from 104% to 125%, and then to 145% after China responded with an 84% and later a 125% tariff of its own, refusing to bend the knee, stating they would not back down. At this point, China announced it would stop retaliating further, saying the tariffs were already so high that there was no longer any meaningful business left between the U.S. and China. Trump claimed that China wants to make a deal with us, but doesn't know how to start. However, the reality may be that China never called at all. Trump also said that more than 70 countries called him saying, "Sir, we really want to make a deal with you, please, please," and claimed they were willing to kiss his ass to get one. Pause 0. Pause. 3SJD. Vance also reportedly made a controversial comment saying that the Chinese are peasants. Can you believe these comments are coming from the top 2 leaders of the United States of America? Sure, they're rich and powerful so they can say whatever they want, but it raises the question, why did Trump announce a 90-day pause on tariffs? According to Trump, the pause, affecting over 70 countries except China, was meant to give those nations a chance to negotiate new trade deals and avoid further global backlash. In reality, the move served multiple strategic purposes. First, it acted as leverage for negotiations, essentially issuing a deal or tariff ultimatum. Second, it aimed to ease market pressure after the stock market plunged over 20% in response to his earlier tariff announcements. But what alarmed financial leaders even more was the bond market reaction. As stocks crashed, Treasury yields spiked sharply, signaling a potential sell-off in U.S. government bonds. Analysts suggested that China and Japan may have begun offloading U.S. treasuries, possibly as retaliation or to reduce exposure to rising economic risks, prompting the administration to act swiftly before a broader financial crisis unfolded. Third, the pause reflects a divide-and-conquer strategy, offering relief to most countries while keeping pressure on China in an effort to isolate Beijing and rally allies. Finally, from a political optics perspective, it allows Trump to present himself as tough, yet open to negotiation. Meanwhile, Elon Musk strongly criticized Trump's aggressive tariff policies, calling trade advisor Peter Navarro a moron and advocating for zero tariffs between the U.S. and Europe to support free trade. In contrast, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent defended the use of tariffs as a strategic tool, particularly against China, downplaying fears of a recession and emphasizing the long-term goal of correcting trade imbalances, even as critics like Musk warned of disruptions to global supply chains. The question is, what is Trump's ultimate goal in this tariff war? It's obvious that one aim is to weaken China. But when China gets hurt, the U.S. also suffers. Most products are made in China, so tariffs just increase costs for American consumers. At the same time, Chinese workers lose jobs, American buyers look for alternative sources, and shift the cost burden to Chinese sellers, while China retaliates, hurting U.S. exporters as well. U.S. consumers will end up paying more, not to mention that some goods imported from China simply can't be sourced elsewhere. Take rare earth elements as an example. China controls over 60% of global production, and more than 85% of global processing capacity. These materials are critical for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles to military weapon systems. So when tariffs disrupt that supply, there's no easy replacement. Even if the US tries to move manufacturing elsewhere, you can't just build factories overnight. It takes years to build infrastructure, train workers, and establish reliable supply chains. And even if factories are relocated to countries like Vietnam, India, or Mexico, logistics become a serious challenge. Shipping routes, raw material availability, skilled labor, and supplier networks are not instantly transferable. For example, a 2024 report by the U.S. International Trade Commission showed that over 40% of small and mid-sized manufacturers struggled to secure logistics support after shifting production from China. So yes, tariffs may sound like a powerful move on paper, but in the real world, they often bring complex ripple effects that hurt both sides, especially when critical supplies and infrastructure are involved. In the end, no one really wins a trade war. On top of that, China can just shift its factories to countries with lower tariffs, which means the cycle never really ends. Because the US also can't realistically impose high tariffs on every country in the world, doing so would isolate America and push other nations to side with China instead. That's clearly not what the US wants. So what does the US actually want? Some theories suggest that Trump and his cabinet have a larger goal. They want wealthy allies to sign a long-term deal, Mar-a-Lago agreement, to buy U.S. bonds with 50 to 100-year terms. That might be the real game behind the scenes. The so-called Mar-a-Lago agreement isn't an official document, but rather a speculative term used to describe what many believe is a behind-the-scenes strategy by Trump and his administration. The idea is that Trump uses trade pressure, like high tariffs, as leverage to push wealthy allies such as Japan, South Korea, and certain European countries to agree to purchase long-term U.S. bonds, sometimes rumored to be 50 or even 100 years in duration. In return, these countries might receive tariff exemptions or favorable trade terms. This approach would help reduce U.S. dependence on China as a bondholder, stabilize the dollar, and support America's massive debt without triggering a financial crisis. The name comes from Trump's private estate, Mar-a-Lago, where he often hosts key meetings, adding a symbolic layer to the theory. Whether real or not, the Mar-a-Lago agreement reflects a broader strategy of mixing economic pressure, personal diplomacy, and financial influence to strengthen America's global position. The rumored Mar-a-Lago agreement draws clear parallels to the Plaza Accord of 1985, which many believe was a turning point that weakened Japan's economic momentum. The Plaza Accord was a formal deal between the US, Japan, West Germany, France, and the UK to intentionally devalue the US dollar against the Japanese yen and German mark. This move was meant to reduce the US trade deficit, but it had lasting consequences. Japan's exports became less competitive, its asset bubble inflated rapidly, and when it burst, Japan entered a long period of stagnation known as the Lost Decades. Similarly, the Mar-a-Lago-style strategy appears to pressure rich allies, like Japan and others, to buy long-term U.S. bonds or accept trade concessions that favor the U.S., all under the guise of partnership. In both cases, the U.S. leverages its global influence to rebalance economic power in its favor. The key similarity lies in how these agreements use financial diplomacy to subtly shift burdens onto allies. In 1985, Japan was pushed into accepting a stronger yen. In 2025, countries may be pushed into locking up capital in low-return U.S. bonds or making economic sacrifices to avoid punitive tariffs. Both strategies serve U.S. interests while potentially undermining the long-term economic strength of its partners. The so-called Mar-a-Lago agreement could very well be a strategic trap for America's allies. By pressuring countries like Japan, South Korea, and European nations to buy long-term U.S. bonds, some rumored to be 50 to 100 years in duration, in exchange for tariff relief or favorable trade terms, the U.S. secures cheap financing while shifting economic risk onto its partners. This mirrors the 1985 Plaza Accord, where Japan agreed to revalue its currency, ultimately triggering an asset bubble and decades of economic stagnation. Similarly, locking into low-yield U.S. debt today could limit these countries' financial flexibility for generations. It also gives the U.S. long-term leverage, making it harder for those nations to push back against future American policies. While some may see it as a necessary deal to maintain market access and avoid trade penalties, others view it as a subtle but powerful trap, one that could drain economic strength over time under the guise of cooperation. Trump has often expressed interest in a weaker US dollar to boost American exports. When the value of the dollar goes down, it becomes cheaper for foreign buyers to purchase US goods because their local currency converts into more dollars. For example, if €1 used to buy $1.10 but now buys $1.25, a European buyer can get more American products for the same amount of euros. This makes US exports more competitive on the global market and can help reduce the trade deficit. A lower dollar can benefit American manufacturers and farmers who rely on selling goods overseas, as their products become more attractive price-wise to international buyers. Another layer to Trump's tariff strategy may be tied to interest rates and US government debt. In 2025, the US government faces a massive challenge. Over $9 trillion in debt needs to be rolled over at a time when interest rates are still relatively high. The higher the rates, the more expensive it becomes to service that debt, leaving less room in the federal budget for spending on things like tariffs, infrastructure, or defense. However, the Federal Reserve, led by a cautious chair, has been reluctant to cut interest rates too soon, citing inflation and economic stability concerns. Some analysts believe Trump is using tariffs as a tool to pressure the Fed. By escalating tariffs and triggering a sharp drop in the stock market, like the 20% plunge in the S&P 500, he may be creating the kind of financial stress that forces the Fed to lower rates. A rate cut would reduce the government's borrowing costs and make it cheaper to refinance debt, helping ease budget pressures. In this sense, tariffs aren't just about trade, they're also part of a bigger game to influence monetary policy and manage the financial strain of America's growing debt burden. People often ask, why doesn't the US just print more money instead of borrowing or pressuring other countries to buy its bonds? While it sounds simple, printing money comes with serious risks. Too much money in circulation leads to inflation, reducing the value of the dollar and making everyday goods more expensive. If overdone, it can cause hyperinflation like in Venezuela or Zimbabwe. More importantly, the US dollar is the world's reserve currency and its strength relies on global trust. Reckless printing could scare off investors, push other countries to move away from the dollar, and damage America's financial credibility. If that happens, no one would want to hold dollars anymore because its value would drop too quickly, making it unreliable as a store of wealth. That's why the US still chooses to borrow through bond markets. It maintains stability, signals fiscal responsibility, and allows allies to support the system without triggering economic panic. In short, printing money isn't free, it comes at a cost that could destabilize both the US economy and the global financial system. When the dollar is strong, Americans often stop producing as much because they can easily buy cheaper goods from other countries. This creates a habit of consumption over production, making the economy more dependent on imports. Over time, this can make people and businesses less motivated to build or manufacture things at home. On top of that, many Americans are used to spending tomorrow's money today, relying on credit and debt to maintain their lifestyle. So when jobs are lost, many find it harder to cope because they haven't saved for tough times. In contrast, many people in Asia, especially in countries like China, have a culture of saving money and working hard for the future. They are more used to enduring hardship and long-term struggle, having gone through many difficult periods throughout their history. In this trade war, it's unclear who will ultimately win, the US or China, but one thing is clear, China may be able to endure longer because its people are more prepared for sacrifice, while many in the US are not used to hard conditions after decades of comfortable living. That brings up another important reason why Trump wants the dollar to go down, to bring jobs back to the American people. When the dollar is too strong, US goods, like cars, machinery, and electronics, become too expensive for other countries to buy. For example, if a US-made car costs $30,000, a strong dollar means it might feel like $40,000 to a foreign buyer, making it harder to compete with cheaper imports from Japan, Korea, or Germany. This hurts American manufacturers and leads to fewer jobs at home. By lowering the value of the dollar, Trump hopes to make U.S. exports more affordable and attractive to global buyers, which would boost domestic production and create more jobs for Americans. A weaker dollar makes made-in-USA products cheaper for the world and encourages companies to invest and manufacture in the U.S. rather than outsourcing jobs abroad. Trump's goal in bringing jobs back to the U.S. isn't about reviving low-wage, labor-intensive industries like clothing or shoe manufacturing. He knows Americans aren't willing to work long hours for low pay in those sectors. Instead, he's focused on restoring high-value strategic industries that offer better wages and align with the American preference for management, skilled trades, and innovation-driven roles. This includes manufacturing in areas like steel, aluminum, and automotive, semiconductors and advanced technology to reduce dependency on China, energy and rare earth production for national security, and defense and aerospace which provide high-paying critical jobs. Even in the electric vehicle sector, Trump emphasizes domestic production to counter foreign dominance. His approach is about rebuilding America's industrial strength with jobs that support economic independence and match the lifestyle and expectations of the U.S. workforce. Not just any job, but the right kind of job. So what happens if U.S. allies say no thanks to buying 50 to 100-year U.S. bonds? What if they decide they'd rather face the tariffs and work more closely with China instead? We'll explore in the next video. If you enjoyed this topic, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what's coming next. And if you have thoughts or theories, drop a comment below. We'd love to hear what you think.